Welcome to today's webcast. As you may know, Imaginate is a subsidiary of RAND Worldwide. We are a leading provider of Autodesk solutions, professional services, and training. Alongside of Imaginate is RAND 3D. They deal with Dassault and PTC software. And then also is Ascent, who write and produce the training manuals for Autodesk, PTC, and Dassault software. So if you've ever taken a class with us, then you've worked out of an Ascent training manual. Okay, and here's a map of some of our offices across North America. This is an older map. We have opened up additional offices in other places. I do not have an updated version of that, but we have other pins all over the place. So as you're looking around that map, you can probably see that we have an office close by. So we can help you out in all of your solutions needs. And a little bit about what we do, our professional services group. I do work for the professional services group. I am in the manufacturing solutions division for Imaginate. We do consulting, we do data and PLM, implementation, process automation, and software development. That's what I get into for the majority of time. That's what we're going to talk about today, doing some automation work, right? We do BIM management, outsourcing, reality capture, facilities management as well. And we do all kinds of versions of training, whether it be self-paced e-learning or doing online training. Obviously, in-person training these days is taking a bit of a hit. But we still do offer our online classes. And our Autodesk is the leading provider of Autodesk software products. And with Imaginate and Autodesk together, we've got proven implementation methodologies. We've got our Productivity Now, or our P-Now site, where you can go do some of that self-paced training as well. Okay. So let me go ahead and cancel this, and I'll pull up Inventor, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty of what we're here to talk about today. So we automate parts and assemblies all day long, right? But it's that 2D drawing that we have to provide to our customers, whether those be internal customers, manufacturing floor, or our external customers. Today we're going to talk about 2D-based annotations. For those of you that use model-based definitions or MBD, those annotations can be automated as well. And we did a webcast about that back in July of 2018, if you want to go back and take a look at that. If you've tried to automate your annotations before the release of Inventor 2021, you had to do that with API calls. Okay. Inventor had drawing snippets. Pop open my rules editor here real quick. It used to be called the drawing, right? Not classic. Now that we have the new category, they've renamed this. We always had these snippets from the previous versions, but they dealt a lot with drawing views, manipulating those views, manipulating my sheet, moving my views around, etc., and working with title blocks and borders. There was some work there with balloons, but nothing really about annotations, about dimensions or leaders, etc. Again, if you're trying to do all that stuff before, you had to deal with straight API calls. So today we're here to talk about the new snippets that are in the drawing category here. Okay, we're not going to be able to get to all of them. We're going to focus a lot on the linear dimensions and the arguments that it takes, and understand how those same can be applied to some of the other dimension styles. We're going to talk about capturing the current state of drawing entities, ways I can get information out of my drawing easily, and then paste it into my rules editor. And we'll touch base on center marks, leaders, and some best practices that we found that you should be using while you're doing some of this annotation. Okay. So we're going to work with this part today, this 2021 drawing snippets part file. If I take a look at my model browser over here, nothing really fantastic going on, right? I've just got my features as normal. What you might notice down here at the bottom are a lot of work points. Okay, As I hover over these, we can see them highlight out in the screen. They're at various points throughout my model. Most of them are attached to edges, whether it be the midpoint of an edge or on a vertex somewhere. And we're going to use those as part of our annotating. Okay. I do tend to follow very standard naming schemes. So you'll notice at the beginning of all of mine here, it says WPO. That way, when I see that name anywhere in any of my rules, I know that it's a work point. Okay, I name work planes WPs or work axis WA. That's just a way that I know very easy by looking at something what it is. Okay, and I'll take a quick look at the parameters up here as well. Nothing spectacular going on there either, right? Just some dimensions that are controlling the width, length, thickness of this thing. My hole locations, whether or not the hole is required, whether or not my chamfer, how big my chamfer is, etc. Okay, and there's also a one single rule in this that is controlling the suppression state of hole one based upon that Boolean parameter called hole required. Okay. And then we also have a simple form that I can control some of these variables. Okay, nothing too exciting going on there. We also have applied a lot of name geometry to this. Name geometry was released back in 2019, I believe, and it was used a lot for prior to 2021 for constraining parts together. It's a way of getting information or getting a face, some entity out of my model in order to do something with it. If I go to my geometry tab here on my iLogic browser, I'll see that I've got a whole lot of things named, and I'm going to temporarily turn the visibility of those on. Don't get scared by looking at this. I've named everything in here, okay? As I hover over these, we can see the top face. I've got corner points. I've got hole faces. I've got front faces. Anything that I want to be able to, in this case, annotate, has name geometry applied to it. Now, as we get into actually doing the capture current state, we'll see that I don't need to have named this. But again, I like standardized naming schemes, and this allows me to name it what I want to name it. Okay, so I'm going to turn that off. And if you're not familiar with name geometry, it's simply a matter of picking an entity on my part, right-click it, and then I can assign a name. This particular face already has one, so my options there are to show that, edit it, or delete that. Okay, so now we've taken a quick look at the model. I'm going to make a quick drawing here of that part. Okay, just a very simple drawing with two views. I do want to rename my views. Again, anything I'm trying to manipulate with iLogic or any method, I want to rename it. I want to know that it's the right view. I don't want to have to guess that it's view 2 or view 3 or view 4. This helps me understand, again, in my code, what I'm doing. So I'm going to add a quick rule here. I'm not even going to bother naming this because I'm only doing this temporarily. And I'm going to place in the new add linear dimension snippet. And that is in my new drawing category here. So I'm going to come down to linear dimension. I'll double click that guy. It gets entered into my rules editor. I've upped the font size here rather large just so that we can see everything. Okay, and let's talk a little bit about what this snippet is doing. It's declaring a bunch of objects and then assigning those objects based upon things in my model, right? I'm declaring sheet 1 in this first line as the sheet that's named sheet :1, right? That's the default name for naming a sheet. Same thing with my view here. That is getting the item by name, named view 1 in this case, That's part of this drawing views collection that's on sheet 1. Okay. I need to know what view I'm working with when I'm going to annotate things or when I'm going to get intent from things. Okay. This next one is really where I'm getting the information from my model that I want to dimension. Okay. It's declaring an entity here called name geometry 1. And again, from whatever specific view I'm working with, I'm doing the get intent function. It's getting the entity in my drawing view, actually the curve that makes up that entity, and then it's going to give that back to me as name geometry 1. So in this case, it would be looking for something called name geometry 1 in my model. We're going to see, I'm going to call out things like front face and whole face, all that name geometry that we saw previously. Okay. Next, it's declaring the GenDims, which is just a collection of the general dimensions that are on sheet 1. Right? I could have multiple sheets. I could have, right? Okay. And then here's where I'm actually adding the dimension. LinDim1, it's doing the add linear function on those general dimensions. And by default there, I'm only getting 3 of the arguments. Okay, I'm getting the dimension name, which is the first option here. I'm getting my text origin, and then I'm getting the intent, or what am I trying to dimension with this line of code. If I hover over the add linear function there, that purple text, if I'm using my standard color scheme in my rules editor, I can see the full expansion of what's going on in that function. It tells me that the first argument is a name as a string. So I know that has to be a string object. The second is the text origin, right? That is a 0.2D object that's looking for. Think of while you're manually placing that annotation, that dimension, you're picking an XY position on your drawing for where you want that text to be. And that's what the text origin is. And then the last argument that we see in the default snippet there is the intent 1, which is geometry intent. Again, that's the curve that's being generated by whatever object I've picked up on my third line there, that get intent line. We also see multiple optional arguments, right? There's intent 2, there's dimension type, there's layers, etc. Those are additional arguments that you could provide if that's what you want to see, control. And then at the very bottom there, it kind of gives you a little help. Tells you what those valid intent combinations could be. What can I dimension between, or what can I dimension at all? Between 2 points, between 2 curves. I can do one specific linear curve, right? Okay, now that we know what that linear dimension is looking for, again, we're going to supply it with a name. We're going to supply it with a origin point, and then we're going to supply it with something that we want to dimension. Okay, so let's look at how we can get that information. I'm going to go ahead and cancel this and not bother saving this rule. Back out in my model, one of the other new things in 2021 is the capture current state. I can select or highlight over any curve in a drawing view, right click, and then I have this iLogic flyout, and then a capture current state flyout there. Now, if I have modified this part already, I simply get the code clipboard dialog box that pops up. If this is a brand new part that I haven't modified from this drawing, I'm going to get a dialog box that says, in order for me to assign a name to this edge, I have to be able to modify that part. So take a look at what it's giving me here. It's giving me, in essence, those same top 3 lines that we saw previously. It's declaring sheet 1. It's declaring the front view, right? We're not getting view 1 because I've renamed my view already. So it knows that it's looking for front underbar view. And then that that geometry already has a name assigned to it, or an attribute assigned to it, a tag about it. It's called get face. So again, it's declaring top face as the front view and the intent of that, or that curve that's being generated there. Okay. Everything that shows up here in the code clipboard, as it says toward the top here, gets copied to my clipboard for the rules editor. Okay. Unfortunately, it doesn't get copied to a clipboard that I can use elsewhere as well. It's only I can paste into the rules editor. So I'm going to just go ahead and hit OK here. And then I'm going to right click and create a rule called overall dims. And then I'm going to paste that bit of code that it generated for me. Okay. Now I'm going to go again, put in my linear dimension snippet. Go to my drawing category, double click linear dimension, and we get a lot of duplication up here at the top, right? Those top 3 lines I don't really need because I got that from my capture current state. So I don't need these guys at all. I'm gonna go ahead and delete those. So I still need that gen dims. I still need the access to the general dimensions from sheet 1. And then my lindim 1 there, I'm going to rename to overall length. That name is used when we start managing entities. Okay, and I'll discuss that when we talk about some best practices. The next entity is the origin point. Okay, again, that's the point 2D or the X comma Y values of where this dimension should land. As we look at the way the default snippet uses, it's got an X and a Y coordinate here, but they're related to my view 1 or whatever view I happen to be working with, and they're in percentages. So this is the X value there. The X value of my dimension text origin is going to be 50% of my view width. And the Y value in this case is going to be 10% of my view width below the view. Okay, so those values go from 0,0 up to 1,1, lower left or up to the upper right. Okay, so the only thing I need to change here for the time being is going to be that name geometry. I don't want a dimension named geometry, so I'm going to copy and paste and replace that with the intent that I'm trying to dimension with. Right, so when I hit save and run here, oh, I almost made a mistake there. I need to change my front view, right? I don't have a view 1, so I've got my front view. And then I'll hit save and run. And there it placed my dimension. It dimensioned that top edge. My text is halfway through my view. And then I am 10% of that view size down below the view because of that negative value. If I select that dimension, we'll see my grit points right there up at the top. I was grabbing that top edge or the edge that's created from that top face. Okay. That's probably not where I want to put that dimension. So I'm going to come back in and edit my overall dimensions. And I'm going to change this to be 1.1. That way I'm 10% above the view, right? Remember, 1 is all the way at the top for my Y. And then we'll save and run. Okay. Notice it removed my other dimension, or it actually edited this dimension. Okay. I come back into my rule again there, hover over that add linear. Take a look at that second to bottom line there. It says it adds or edits a linear dimension, right? I'm editing the overall length dimension in this case. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and save and run that there. What if I didn't want to dimension between 2 faces? Okay, that's where that second optional intent can come in. So let's get some more data out of our drawing view. I'm going to right click here. Again, go to my iLogic flyout, and I want to do the capture current state again. right? It gives me that same information about those sheets, the front view, and then also gives me the bottom face in this case. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and hit OK. I'll go back in and edit my rule. I want my declarations where I'm getting that information about the object up here at the top. So I'm going to place my cursor up there and paste, and notice the only thing I'm getting there is that bottom face. Okay, I'm not getting the repeats of the sheet 1 in the front view. Okay, so I need to create another dimension here. I'm simply going to copy and paste that LinDim 1. Right, copy and paste is your friend. I need to change this guy to 2, and then we'll change to overall width. And I'm going to use the again the front view, but my sheet point needs to be modified, right? I basically need to flip these because I want to go to the right, and then I want the Y value to be in the middle of that. Okay. If I leave it as it is, it's just going to try to dimension that top face. We need that secondary intent, right? Remember that optional intent 2 as a secondary geometry intent. So I'm going to copy my bottom face to my clipboard, and I'm simply going to come here and put in a comma and paste that bottom face. So I see there in bold now, I'm including that optional intent 2 as my geometry intent. Okay, so I'm gonna hit save and run here. And there it created that 4-inch dimension. Okay, going from the top face down to the bottom face. You can also select multiple entities while you're inside of that capture current state. If I come over to this view and capture current state, I've got the bottom face here again, but notice it's in the right view, right? If I still keep that code clipboard button or the dialog box open and click those secondary entities, then it's added that top face. All of that information comes in to my code clipboard. Then I can go back to my rules editor and paste a larger chunk. Okay, it's a way of saving a little bit of time there. Also, nothing wrong with if you know what those values are, right? If you've gone through already and added that name geometry, I could come in here and replicate, lines like this all day long, just modifying what the object name is going to be, and then modifying what that string argument, what intent or what geometry you're trying to find outside in your model. Okay. So that's the basis of a linear dimension. I need to declare some stuff, the sheet, the view, whatever entities you're trying to dimension. In this case, I'm dimensioning both the top face and the bottom face. I get access to my general dimensions collection here. And then I'm using the add linear for the various dimensions, right? What's my dimension string? What's the name? What's the text? And then what's the intent that you're trying to dimension? So let's talk a little bit about some best practices before we move on and look at some of the other stuff. One has to do with this text origin. This is a easy way of placing where things show. It's not giving me the most control, right? 10% of that view, what does that mean, right? I should be spacing my dimensions a 1/2 inch off the object, and then secondary dimensions should be placed 3/8 off of that first dimension, right? If I'm doing that where it's percentage of views like this, I don't really, I don't want to have to go do the math to try to figure out what that is. So another way of doing that is, instead of using this default sheet point, is to use some of those work points that we have out there in the model. I can use those as offsets. So let's jump back out to my model here real quick. And I've got a work point here called WPO edge top front. Okay, I don't know if you can see it there in the model, but it's right in the middle of that top front face edge. I'm going to use that and get its sheet point and then space my dimensions away from that. I know where that point is in space, or I can figure out where that point is in space and then offset it to values that I want it to be. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my drawing here, go back to my overall dimensions, and I'm going to include a secondary line of code here. Oop, I copied too much. So I'm going to copy just that bottom line, paste it in there, and then I'm going to call him WPO edge top front. And then I'm going to get that entity. I hope that's what I called it. Right, I'm getting the intent of that point. Let me go ahead and run that to make sure that's what I actually called it. And it is. I would have got an error there if it couldn't have found this entity inside of that drawing view. Okay, then I'm going to do some calculations here for where that point needs to be. So I'm going to dim top length position as this drawing, dot geometry, dot point 2D. Okay. Again, that point 2D you can think of as an XY point somewhere on my drawing in this case. Okay, I'm defining that at this point at 0, 0. I don't really care where it's going. And then I can set it to the value of what that work point is according to my sheet. So again, I'm going to copy and paste just to make it easier there. And I'm going to do the point on sheet property of that point. That's going to translate, let me move this out of the way just so quick. That's going to translate that point to an XY value on my sheet. And then that's going to be stored in the database units for the position top length POS. Okay. And then I don't need to modify the X because our point was along the midpoint there. I really only need to modify the Y. So again, I'm going to say the dot Y of my top length position equals the Y plus whatever value I want that to move up. Okay, talked earlier about that being a ½ inch off that. And then I'm going to modify that by the front view scale. Okay. It might look complicated, but again, we're very simply getting that point in space relative to my drawing, and then I'm going to move 0.5 inches up. Okay. I don't have to worry again about modifying the X value. So now I don't need this long string here. I can replace that with my top length position. Right. Remember our add linear there, it's looking for a point 2D in essence. And that's when I'm supplying it here with this top length position entity. Okay. You saw that thing shifted up ever so slightly. If I go make a sketch on this drawing and create a line from that midpoint up a ½ inch, right? There we are, right on that extension line. Okay. I know exactly where that dimension is going to end up, right where I want it to be. Again, that comes in very handy when I'm trying to add multiple dimensions, right? When we get into dimensioning that whole, I'm going to want to be able to move things around. I can do the same thing here for that right dimension, and to make things a little easier so we're not watching Randy type the entire time. I do have this text already written out. So all I'm doing here is I'm getting another point, right? That work point edge right front. And then I'm doing the top width position the same way we did the other one. Okay. I'm creating a point 2D. I'm getting that right front point on the sheet. And then I'm modifying the X in this case, right? I want it to move over to the right a ½ inch. Then I would modify all of that there. Okay. Replacing that long front view with just my top width position. Hit save and run, we see that dimension move ever so slightly there. Okay. Something else I should be doing here is using my manage entities. Works very similar to the manage objects that was introduced, I think, again in 2019, when I start adding components with the iLogic manage components. It's going to handle deletion of things that aren't required. Okay. And that snippet is right here in my drawing snippets. So to do things proper, I'm going to put that in there, and then I'm going to move these two lines of code right inside of there. Okay. So let's start talking about dimensioning that hole. Again, a little bit more on linear dimensions, and then controlling how I can control dimension placement based upon certain conditions, and adding conditions for whether or not I'm going to get those hole dimensions. So I'm going to add another rule here called OldDims. And again, I'm going to cheat a little bit so we don't watch Randy type. And I'm going to paste some code in here. Okay. Size this a little bit more so we can talk about what's going on. The stuff here at the top should be familiar at this point, right? We're declaring that sheet. We're getting the general dimension collection, and then I'm declaring that front view. Now, if you're going to put all of these into one single rule, right, I wouldn't be doing this every time, but for this situation, I thought it'd be cleaner if we separated them so we know what each individual rule is doing. Then I also want to get some model information. So this is something that's been in iLogic for a while now, down in my advanced drawing API category. I'm going to get the model document name. I'm going to use that to get my parameter. Okay, I want to drive whether or not I'm getting a certain dimension based upon parameters inside of my model. So in this case, it's declaring that model name, and it's getting the full file name out of the model document. Think of when you're working in a drawing and you place a view, it's that first model that goes inside of that drawing. And then I'm going to use the get a model parameter. Okay. I'm going to call this guy hole required, and then the dimension is hole underbar required, or I'm sorry, the parameter. Okay, so we're getting that value out of my model, and we're storing it in the hole required variable. And then down here at the bottom, it's checking to see in a conditional block if hole required is true. If it is, then I need to go get a bunch of information, and then I need to place some dimensions. Okay, so again, these guys at the top, nothing new there. I'm getting intent from the entities that are required. My hole face, where's the hole center? Some points that I'm going to use to dimension off of, some faces that I'm going to use to dimension off of. Okay, I also need the hole diameter. I almost forgot that. I just noticed it in my code down there. So I'm going to get the hole diameter parameter as well. I'm using that to place where that dimension goes. right? If we look at my calculate positions block right down here, same thing there. I'm getting that 0.2t object. I'm getting its point on the sheet, and then I'm modifying its X and Y value. I'm moving it up a 1/4 inch plus the whole radius times the view scale, and then I'm moving it over to the right, the same values. Okay. I'm also placing some hole dimensions on there, right? These bottom hole X POS and hole Y POS, that's dimensioning between my face and the hole center, and then another face and the hole center. Okay. And I apparently have missed something else too. Oh, I had modified that. Had the wrong intent names going on there. That's what I get for modifying something after just replacing those guys. And front view. Alrighty. And I'm still missing some front views. There we go. Required. So nothing like whole face. Well, back face, left face, whole Y, front view, edge right front, edge top front. Front views. Okay, let's do some suppression there. So something in the bottom here that I have. There we are. All righty. I apologize for that. So now I have additional dimensions, right? My whole X, my whole Y, and then that whole diameter that's getting placed. Okay, but notice I'm placing it up on top of the other dimensions that are there. Okay, more than likely, I would want that if hole required in my overall dimensions as well. So I'm going to steal some information here out of this rule and go place it in my overall dimensions. Right, I'm going to get that whole required parameter just like we saw before, and then I can control what that offset is. So if hole required, then I want to space them out a certain value. Else something else. Right. So if the hole is not there, I'm going to place my values a ½ inch away. If the hole is there, I want them to be, I'm just going to throw it out at 1 inch. Okay, so now I've moved my dimensions out. More than likely, when we're talking about annotating like this, I would want to add these things as event triggers, right? Anytime a view changes or when I'm opening that document, I want to throw these dimension changes onto that drawing view change and also on the after open document. Okay. And then we can test that by popping over to my part, opening up key parameters, turning off that hole required, right? My hole suppressed, going back to the drawing. Those other annotations disappeared. And then my 6-inch and my 4-inch moved into being a 1/2 inch off of that view. Okay, let me go back and turn that guy on. And then my dimensions move as they need to be there. Okay, so let's talk about center marks real quick. I'm going to add another rule here called center marks. And again, I'm going to copy some code I've already generated. Okay. So the top 3 lines there, again, nothing new, the same things we've seen before. I'm getting some model parameters, just like we saw before. I need to know whether or not that hole is required, right? If the hole is required, then I'm going to get that hole edge, right? I'm getting or declaring a hole intent here off my front view, get intent of the object called hole edge, or the object that has the attribute called hole edge there. And I've also got some additional information on here. I'm getting the center point of that hole edge. Okay. The K center point intent is telling me where that hole edge, that's where I'm going to place my center mark. Okay. And then if I look at the snippets for center marks, again, it's the sheet 1 dot center marks add, and then the arguments for this are the name, again, some string, and then the intent. In this case, it's going to be my object called hole intent. Notice we have, again, multiple optional intents there, or optional arguments that can be added. Okay, hit save and run, and there's my center mark. Okay. One more thing to talk about is adding some leaders. So I'm going to add a rule here called leaders. And again, to save a little bit of time, I'm going to copy and paste some code. It's coming in there a little bit hairy looking, but okay. So at the top here, again, I'm declaring my objects, my sheet. I'm going to put this on the right view. Okay. And then I'm getting a point that I'm going to apply my leader arrow point to. I've named this object leader arrow point, so I understand that that's what's going to get attached to. And then instead of general dimensions, leader notes are part of the drawing notes collection. Right? So I'm declaring here leader notes as the drawing notes leader notes. And again, that's all part of the leader snippet. If I go place leader note snippet in there, we get that same information. Right. I'm going to delete that for the time being and just show you that dim leader note 1. So again, I'm doing the add method on the leader notes. And then the arguments are the name as a string, and then the leader points as a list. It could be a list. And then what am I attaching that to as the geometry intent? Right. That's what I got the WPO edge right back. That's where I start my leader. That's where the arrowhead's going to end up being. Okay. So let me clear that guy off for the time being. There's multiple leader note positions being built here. Right. The same way we saw before. I'm doing position 1, position 2, and then position 3. I'm doing 3 just so I can add it to a point list. Okay. So position 1 is, again, where that leader arrow point is, the point on sheet property of that leader arrow point, which is the WPO edge right back, right? It's that back corner of my view back over here. That's where I want to start my leader at. And then my secondary position, the leader note position 2, think about, again, as you're manually placing that leader, if I make another click, it's going to add another vertices there, right? So that's what the second is. I'm moving in the X value, 0.5, and in the Y value, 0.5. And then I'm adding yet another one just to show that it can be done. Okay. Normally we would want probably just where the arrowhead is and then where the landing line starts. And then I'd right click and continue, or if I'm on a single point, right, I'd move right into adding text if I was manually placing this annotation. In this case, I'm adding a third leader position, and I'm moving from position 2 over a ½ inch, but only up a ¼ inch. Okay, I'm going to clean this up just so we can see this a little bit more. That leader point list. If I go take a look at my drawing category snippet, again, I've got a 0.2D list here. And that's just a way of adding multiple points to a list, and then that list is what gets called out in my leader add method. Okay, just like we saw before where I was creating a 0.2D, this is creating a 0.2D list with the .x and the .y of my position 3, my position 2, and my position 1. Okay. And then as we saw before, the add annotation using my manage block, dim leader note 1 is doing the add method on my leader notes. Whatever that name is as a string, the list of my 0.2D, my attached to point, which in this case is my leader arrow point, and then whatever I want that text to be, right? The omit paint in this option. Okay, so if I hit save and run now, there it placed my omit paint leader over my right view, right? It got connected to that point in space, and then I've got a vertices there. That was my leader position 2, and then leader position 3 is the beginning of my landing there. Okay. So there are some limitations that are exposed through, what I can do with the iLogic snippets. There's some things that I still can't do that you can do with the full API yet. I say yet because I have no doubt that those things are going to come out at some point. For doing basic dimensioning like what we're showing on here, it still works great. As I said, I have no doubt that we're going to get additional stuff here in the future. You can still get to some of those other limitations, those other properties, those other methods and things of dimensions. If you're used to doing things with the API, I can still get to things like changing what that text is. Okay, I just need to modify that value to get its native entity object. So in this case, if I wanted to modify that overall length, right, that's that 6 dimension right there. If I want to change his text, say, I could always go to the lindim1 dot, right, and then I get my contextual help there, native entity, right? These are all methods and properties that I could be modifying based off of that linear dimension, right? I'm going to go back and modify his text property. And then in there, I want to modify the formatted text. And I'll do a string concat dimension value. And then just the word length. Okay, so what this is going to do is place that dimension value that's currently in there. And I'm just putting the word length on the back end of that. I should put a space in there. Okay, so I still can get in there and modify things. If I double click this, right? Nothing really special about that. It still looks the same as if I went in there and manually modified those things. Okay. So again, if you want to mix in some API and stuff in there, something that you can't get with just the snippets, modifying the text, changing tolerances of things like that, I can still use the iLogic snippets to create those dimensions. I just have to modify it, that text or those values in a slightly different way. Okay. So again, as I was putting together this presentation, I realized that there's a whole lot of information in there, and I preferred to get a little bit deeper and so you can understand what those arguments are that linear dimension is looking for. And then that same information can be extrapolated, you know, to the chamfer dimensions, the angular dimensions, the whole notes, etc.